The gun was already pressed against Clyde Dawson's temple when Abigail Pritchard finally understood the full weight of the secret she had been keeping. She stood in the doorway of the Dusty Creek jailhouse, her knuckles white against the wooden frame, her breath coming in short, ragged bursts that had nothing to do with the 100 yards she had just sprinted across the sun-baked main street of Harlow, Texas. The year was 1878, and the late afternoon sun threw long copper shadows across the floor. And none of that mattered because the man she had come to love more than she had ever intended was on his knees in the center of the room with a pistol barrel cold against his skull. Wade Calloway held the gun. Wade Calloway, who had ridden into Harlow 3 weeks ago calling himself a land surveyor and smiling at everyone with that wide, practiced smile. Wade Calloway, who Abigail now knew was in fact a hired man sent by her late father's business partner, Edmund Graves, to retrieve what Graves believed was rightfully his. To retrieve her. Or rather, to retrieve the deed she carried in the lining of her traveling bag. The deed to 600 acres of the most water-rich land in Bexar County, land that her father had signed over to her with his last coherent breath, and that Edmund Graves had been hunting ever since. "Put the bag on the floor, Miss Pritchard," Calloway said, and his voice was almost gentle, which made it worse. "Put it on the floor, slide it toward me, and I walk out of here without painting the walls with your lawman's good sense." Clyde was not looking at her. He was looking at the floor, jaw set, breathing controlled, and she could see from the angle of his shoulders that he was calculating something, measuring distances, waiting for an opening that might never come. "He is not my lawman," Abigail heard herself say, and the words came out entirely wrong, entirely too soft, entirely too true. Calloway laughed. "Could have fooled me, the way he came charging in here the second somebody told him you were in trouble." She felt the flush rise in her cheeks despite everything. Despite the gun, despite the terror, despite the fact that she had spent the last 3 weeks telling herself that whatever was growing between her and Clyde Dawson was inconvenient and inadvisable, and needed to stop before it became something she could not walk away from. She had not stopped it, and now he was on his knees. "The bag," Calloway repeated and pressed the barrel harder. Clyde's eyes finally found hers. Dark brown, steady as bedrock, and carrying the single clearest message she had ever received from another human being. "Do not give it to him. Whatever happens, do not give it to him." She set her jaw. She looked at Wade Calloway. She said, "All right." And she threw the bag hard and fast directly at Calloway's face. The distraction lasted exactly 1 second, but Clyde Dawson needed half of that. He drove his elbow back into Calloway's ribs, twisted sideways out from under the gun barrel, and the weapon discharged into the ceiling in a burst of plaster dust and noise that Abigail felt in the center of her chest. By the time the dust settled, Clyde had Calloway's wrist wrenched behind his back and the man's own gun pressed to the nape of his neck, and Calloway was very still and very quiet. "Wade Calloway," Clyde said, breathing hard but controlled, "you are under arrest." Abigail stood in the doorway. Her hands were trembling. Her bag lay on the floor between them, the deed still safely stitched into the lining. She thought, wildly and inappropriately, that she really needed to stop ending up in situations that required this man to save her. Then she thought about where they had started, 3 weeks and a lifetime ago, and how none of it had been simple from the very first moment. Abigail Pritchard had arrived in Harlow, Texas on the morning of the 4th of October, 1878, on the southbound stage from San Antonio. She had not planned to stay. She had planned to pass through, change horses, purchase enough supplies to last another 4 days of travel, and continue south toward the border where she intended to disappear into a country that Edmund Graves did not own. She had $2.40 to her name, a bag with a secret sewn into it, a year's worth of grief for a father she had buried in May, and a profound distrust of strangers that had been installed in her like a locked door after 18 months of running. She was 24 years old, and she felt considerably older. Harlow was a town of perhaps 400 souls strung along a single main street in the dry scrubland south of San Antonio. It had a general store, a livery, a hotel with 6 rooms, a saloon that Abigail had no intention of entering, a church that had lost its minister 2 months prior, and a jailhouse that served as both the sheriff's office and the municipal court. It was the kind of town that felt like it was waiting for something, though whether that something was prosperity or disaster was not immediately clear. She stepped off the stage, gathered her bag, and immediately walked directly into the chest of the tallest man she had encountered in recent memory. She would have fallen if he had not caught her. His hands closed around her upper arms with an automatic, steadying grip, and she had a brief impression of sun-worn flannel, the smell of horses and cedar, and a face that was angular and weathered and looking down at her with an expression she would later describe as professionally concerned, as though catching stumbling women was simply part of the job description. "Beg your pardon, ma'am," he said. "You all right?" She stepped back, pulling herself out of his grip with perhaps more force than was strictly necessary. "Perfectly fine," she said. "Thank you." He touched the brim of his hat. He had a sheriff's star pinned to his shirt, which she noticed because she had trained herself to notice such things. Badges meant questions, questions meant records, records meant trails that Edmund Graves could follow. "Welcome to Harlow," he said. "Clyde Dawson, sheriff, if you need anything." "I will not be staying," she said. He nodded as though she had said something perfectly ordinary and walked on, and that should have been the end of it. It was not the end of it. The stage company informed her, when she inquired about the next southbound departure, that the line had been suspended for a minimum of 5 days due to a washed-out bridge outside of Laredo, the result of unusual fall rains. There was no other reliable route south by public transport. She could hire a private conveyance, but the only man in Harlow with a suitable wagon was old Garrett Finch, who was laid up with a broken leg and not accepting passengers. 5 days. In a town of 400 where the sheriff had already seen her face. She stood in the stage office and reviewed her options with the cold practicality she had developed over the past year and a half. She could not afford to be remembered. She could not afford to be noticed. She could not afford, above all, to have anyone think she was anything other than an ordinary woman passing through on ordinary business. She took a room at the hotel. She paid for it with careful frugality. She told the proprietress, a broad woman named Mrs. Hannigan, who had the comfortable air of someone who knew every piece of gossip in a 50-mile radius, that her name was Abigail Marsh, and that she was traveling to visit an aunt in Brownsville. The lie had served her well for months. It slid out of her now as easily as breathing. She ate a quiet supper in the hotel dining room that first evening, positioned with her back to the wall in a habit she had not bothered to break, and was reading a 3-week-old newspaper she had found on the seat when a shadow fell across her table. "Miss Marsh," Clyde Dawson stood there, hat in hand, looking genuinely apologetic, which caught her off guard because most men with badges did not look apologetic. "I apologize for interrupting your supper. Mrs. Hannigan mentioned you'd be staying a few days on account of the bridge. I make a point of welcoming folks who are stuck with us for a while." He paused, purely a courtesy, not an official matter. She looked at him steadily. "That is very kind, Sheriff." He waited, and when she did not invite him to sit, he nodded again with that same easy acceptance of her curtness and turned to go. Something stopped her. She was not sure what it was. Perhaps it was the simplicity of his manner, so utterly without calculation that it was almost disorienting after a year and a half of seeing calculation in every face she met. Perhaps it was simply loneliness, which she had carried so long it had become part of her, and which sometimes in unguarded moments made itself known. "You may sit if you wish," she said. "I have no objection to company." He sat, and he ordered coffee, and they talked about nothing in particular. The town, the weather, the washed-out bridge, the possibility of rain before November. He did not ask her where she was from or why she was traveling alone or where exactly in Brownsville her aunt lived. He talked the way a man talks when he is comfortable with silence and not trying to fill it, offering things only when they seemed relevant. She found herself, almost against her will, beginning to relax. He told her he had been sheriff of Harlow for 3 years, having come up from the Texas Rangers after a disagreement with certain administrative policies that he described only as a difference of philosophy. He had grown up in East Texas, not far from Nacogdoches. He had a horse he called Bishop who was, in his considered opinion, the most sensible living creature in Harlow County. She laughed at that. She had not laughed at anything in a considerable time, and the sound surprised her. He looked at her when she laughed, not the way some men looked, assessing and proprietary. He looked the way people look when they have unexpectedly heard something beautiful and are not quite sure what to do about it. She cleared her throat. "I should turn in," she said. "Of course." He stood, replaced his hat. "Good night, Miss Marsh. I hope the bridge is repaired promptly." She watched him go and told herself firmly that nothing about this was complicated. The following morning she discovered that her bag had been searched. She stood in her room at the hotel and went through everything with methodical precision, the way her father had taught her, cataloging what was present and what was disturbed. Nothing was missing. The deed was still in the lining, exactly where she had stitched it herself. But someone had opened the bag, gone through the clothing inside, replaced things with the almost right tidiness of a person trying to conceal the search. She sat on the edge of the bed and breathed through the cold spike of fear that went through her, and thought through what she knew. Someone in Harlow knew who she was, or suspected. Someone had been told to look for her, or for what she was carrying. The most likely source was Wade Calloway, who had arrived on the same stage she had. She realized now, though she had not paid him particular attention. A pleasant-faced man in his 30s with a surveyor's satchel and an easy manner. She had not thought twice about him. She needed to leave. She needed to leave today, bridge or no bridge, and she needed to find another way south. She was planning her exit when there was a knock at her door. "Miss Marsh," it was Mrs. Hannigan. "You have a visitor in the parlor, a Mr. Calloway. He says you are acquainted." Abigail looked at her reflection in the small mirror on the washstand. The woman looking back at her was careful and controlled and showed nothing. "Tell him I will be down directly," she said. She was not, in fact, acquainted with Wade Calloway, which meant he had come to introduce himself, which meant this was a preliminary conversation, a probing of the ground before whatever came next. She needed to go downstairs, be cordial, give away nothing, and use the conversation to determine how much he knew. She straightened her collar. She went downstairs. Calloway was in the parlor, standing by the window with the surveyor's satchel over his shoulder and that practiced, pleasant smile on his face. He introduced himself with excessive warmth and said he believed they had shared the stage from San Antonio. What a remarkable coincidence that they were both detained by the same flooded bridge. Was she comfortable in Harlow? Had she tried the dining room's pie? She answered in monosyllables and watched him, cataloging the small inconsistencies that her father, who had been a lawyer for 30 years, had taught her to notice. The way his eyes moved to her bag when he thought she was not watching. The way his questions about her destination, dressed in casual conversation, followed a pattern that was slightly too organized to be natural. He knew she was Abigail Pritchard, or he strongly suspected it. He might not yet know where the deed was. He was scouting. She excused herself after 15 minutes and went directly to the jailhouse. She stood outside for a full 3 minutes before she went in, arguing with herself, running alternatives, finding none that were better. She had $2.40, no transport, a man who was likely working for Edmund Graves, and 5 days minimum in a town too small to disappear in. She needed help. She hated needing help. She had been hating it for a year and a half and had kept on needing it anyway, which was one of the more humbling lessons the road had taught her. She went in. Clyde Dawson was at his desk, writing something in a ledger, and he looked up with no particular surprise and said, "Good morning, Miss Marsh. Coffee?" "My name is not Marsh," she said. He set down his pen. He looked at her with quiet attention. "My name is Abigail Pritchard," she said. My father was Thomas Pritchard, who was a property attorney in San Antonio until he died in May of this year. Before he died, he transferred the deed to 600 acres of river land in Bexar County into my name. His business partner, Edmund Graves, believes that deed belongs to him, and he has been attempting to recover it by various means for the past 5 months. There is a man in this town named Calloway who I believe is employed by Graves. He searched my room last night. I am telling you this because I need to know whether Harlow is safe, and I believe you are the appropriate person to tell." She stopped. The parlor clock on the shelf behind Clyde's desk ticked 6 times. "Sit down, Miss Pritchard," he said. She sat. He asked her questions for the next hour. Clear, relevant questions, moving through the situation with a methodical intelligence she had not entirely anticipated, though she was not sure why she had not anticipated it. She told him about Edmund Graves, who was a man of considerable wealth and social influence in San Antonio, which made him dangerous in ways that a simple outlaw was not. She told him about the deed, and why it mattered, and about the months she had spent moving from town to town because Graves had enough reach to find her and not quite enough proof to take the land through the courts, so he had been attempting to obtain the deed itself through increasingly forceful means. She told him about the man who had followed her out of Austin, about the attempt in Laredo that had resulted in her changing her name and her route, about her father who had been many things that were complicated but who had loved her in his particular imperfect way and had made sure in his last coherent days that what was hers could not be easily taken. Clyde listened to all of it without interrupting, and when she finished he was quiet for a moment and then he said, "You've been carrying this alone for 5 months." It was not a question. It carried a weight she had not expected. "Yes," she said. "All right," he said. "Here is what I can do." What he could do was keep Calloway under observation without giving him cause for formal suspicion, since Graves was careful about the law and likely kept his methods just within or close enough to the edges of legality. He could arrange for the outgoing telegraph to Graves's address in San Antonio to be monitored for messages. He could coordinate with the county sheriff, a man named Ben Tolley who he trusted, to ensure that if Graves sent additional people, there would be advance warning. And he could ensure that Abigail Pritchard had somewhere safer than a hotel room with a flimsy lock to keep herself and her bag. "I have a spare room here," he said. "It is not much, but it locks from the inside and I sleep light." She looked at him. Something in her chest was doing something she had not given it permission to do. "That would be highly irregular," she said. "This is Texas," he said, and there was the faintest suggestion of amusement in his voice. "Highly irregular is generally just Tuesday." She moved her things to the jailhouse spare room that afternoon. It was indeed not much. A cot, a washstand, a window with iron bars that she appreciated for reasons quite different from their intended use. She organized her belongings with the practiced efficiency of someone who had been ready to move at a moment's notice for most of a year, and sat on the edge of the cot, and felt something she cautiously identified as a fraction less afraid than she had been in a very long time. It was a dangerous feeling. Safety had been an illusion before. She reminded herself of this firmly. The next morning she woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of someone moving quietly in the other room with deliberate consideration for the person sleeping beyond the wall, and felt the dangerous feeling again, stronger. She got up. She made herself useful. Clyde's filing system, she noticed immediately, was a disaster of good intentions and insufficient follow-through, and she spent the morning reorganizing his wanted notices and outstanding warrants into something approaching coherence while he made his rounds. He came back at noon, looked at the organized desk, and said, "You did not have to do that." "I was restless," she said. "Thank you," he said simply, and that was that. They fell into a rhythm over the next 2 days that had no particular ceremony about it. She helped with the administrative work he generally neglected in favor of the actual job. He kept her informed about Calloway's movements, which were so far unremarkable the man making a convincing show of surveying a property on the eastern edge of town that likely required no surveying at all. She told him things about the land case and about Graves, and gradually, in the mornings over coffee and the evenings over whatever Mrs. Hannigan sent over from the hotel kitchen, about herself. She told him about growing up in San Antonio, the daughter of a man who was alternately magnificent and absent, who had taught her to read a legal document before she could ride a horse, and who had not known quite what to do with a daughter who asked questions he could not always answer. About her mother, who had died when Abigail was 12, and who existed now mostly as a warmth she could still feel when she thought deliberately about certain afternoons. About the law degree she had been 3 months from completing when her father fell ill, and she came home to care for him, and the degree became one of those things that would perhaps happen later. He listened, and occasionally said things that were small and precise, and showed that he had heard her. Not just the words, but the things beneath the words. She told herself she was telling him because it was relevant to the situation, because understanding her background was necessary for his ability to protect her, because information was tactical in this context. She did not entirely believe herself. He told her about the Rangers and the particular moment of the difference of philosophy, which turned out to involve being ordered to participate in an action against a group of Comanche people that he had believed then and now was unprovoked and unnecessary and wrong. He had filed a report. The report had been ignored, and he had resigned 2 days later. He said it without rancor, with the plain, clear directness she was coming to understand as simply how he moved through the world, and she felt the warmth she had been carefully containing move upward and settle somewhere under her sternum where she could not quite reach it. "You gave up a career," she said. "I gave up a particular job," he said. "There is always another." She thought about that for a long time after he said it. On the third evening, a Thursday, the weather turned and brought genuine cold down from the north, and Abigail sat at the desk writing a letter to her father's attorney in San Antonio while Clyde sat by the small stove reading a newspaper, and the whole scene was so ordinary and so extraordinary simultaneously that she had to pause in her writing and look at the lamp flame until she felt steady again. He looked up, felt her stillness, and said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "Are you all right?" "Yes," she said, and then, "No, not entirely." He waited. "I have been moving for a very long time," she said. "I had forgotten what it felt like to sit still for an evening." He set the newspaper down. He said with the careful honesty that was characteristic of him, "I do not want you to leave when the bridge is repaired." The room was very quiet. The stove ticked. "That is not a simple thing to say to me," she said. "I know it," he said. "I am saying it anyway because it is true, and I believe you deserve to hear true things." She looked at him across the lamplit room. "I am a woman with a forged name and a legal dispute, and a man employed by her enemy currently staying at the hotel 60 yards from here," she said. "I am not a simple proposition." "Miss Pritchard," he said, and the use of her real name she was finding, always unexpectedly steadying. "I am the sheriff of a town that nobody important has heard of, and I own nothing worth mentioning except a horse and a decent rifle. I am not offering you simple." Something shifted in her chest, irrevocably. "I have to think," she said. "Take all the time you need," he said, and picked up his newspaper again, and the casualness of it was so perfectly calibrated to her need for it that she was certain, absolutely certain, that it was not casual at all. The bridge remained under repair. She stayed. On the fourth morning, Wade Calloway walked into the jailhouse while Abigail was alone at the desk, Clyde having stepped out to handle a minor dispute at the livery, and he closed the door behind him and dropped the pretense like a coat he had been tired of wearing. "Miss Pritchard," he said, "let us not waste each other's time." She kept her hands still on the desk. "I do not know what you mean," she said. "Mr. Graves has authorized me to offer you $400 for the deed," Calloway said. "Cash, clean. No further pursuit, no further difficulty. You sign the deed over, you take the money, you go wherever you are going, and everyone moves forward with their lives." $400. Her father's land was worth $20,000. Edmund Graves knew she knew that. And if I declined, she said. Calloway smiled pleasantly. That would be unfortunate, he said. Get out of this office, she said. He looked around, taking his time with it. The sheriff is very attentive to you, he said. That must be a comfort. I would hate to see something unfortunate happen to complicate that attentiveness. He left. She sat very still for a moment. Then she stood and went to find Clyde. She found him at the livery, the dispute apparently resolved, and she told him what had happened with the flat, controlled precision of someone who is frightened and refusing to perform it. He listened without expression, and then the expression appeared briefly, something that moved behind his eyes, and he said, "He threatened me." "Indirectly," she said. "That is still a threat," he said. "And I am not fragile, Miss Pritchard." "I know that," she said. "I am not telling you because I think you need protecting. I am telling you because he is escalating and you need to know." He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "Thank you for telling me." They walked back to the jailhouse together, and he sent a telegram to the county sheriff that afternoon, and another to a contact in San Antonio, whose name he did not share with her but whose involvement seemed to reassure him. That evening, there was an incident at the saloon involving a cowhand from the Remsburg ranch and too much whiskey and a disagreement over cards, and Clyde was occupied with it until well past dark. When he came back, he was carrying a small cut above his eyebrow and a mild expression of professional resignation. She made him sit down. She cleaned the cut with water and a clean cloth, standing very close, and neither of them said anything for a while, and the whole of her awareness was of his stillness and the particular quality of the silence between them. "This happens often?" she asked. "Often enough," he said. She finished with the cut. She should have stepped back. She did not quite. He looked up at her from where he sat, and his voice was very quiet. "Abigail," he said, and it was the first time he had used her given name without the miss, and it sounded like something being decided. She stepped back then, but slowly, and said, "Your eyebrow will be fine." He smiled, and it was a real one, not the professionally pleasant expression, but something that reached all the way into his eyes, and she turned away before she could do something inadvisable like tell him exactly what she was thinking. She lay in the spare room and thought about permanence and risk, and the difference between running away from something and running toward it, and did not sleep for a long time. On the 5th day the bridge was declared repaired, and the stage line announced it would resume operations the following morning. Abigail sat in the jailhouse with her bag on the desk in front of her. The deed was in the lining. She could be on the stage tomorrow. She could be in Brownsville in 4 days. She could cross into Mexico and be someone new somewhere Graves had no connections. She could leave. She sat with that for a long time. She thought about 5 months of moving, of false names, of rooms that were temporary by definition. She thought about a practice almost law degree, and a father who was gone, and a piece of land she had never stood on that had cost her more than it would ever be worth if she spent the rest of her life running to keep it. She thought about a man who said true things and meant them. She thought about the fact that running was not a life. It was the shape of a life, the outline, but not the substance. When Clyde came back at noon, she was still sitting there, and he looked at her in the bag and said nothing, just moved to his desk and poured 2 cups of coffee and placed one in front of her. "The stage leaves at 8, he said. "I know," she said. "The question is whether that is where you want to be," he said. She looked at the coffee cup. "Calloway has not left," she said. "He is not going to simply give up because the bridge is open." "No," Clyde agreed. "He is not." "And Graves will send someone else if Calloway fails." "Very likely. So staying does not solve the problem," she said. "It just changes the geography of it." "Staying," he said carefully, "means you are not alone with the problem. That is not nothing." She looked at him then. "You would take that on," she said. "The ongoing trouble of it." "I am already in it," he said. "That is not a criticism, just a fact. Calloway made it my business when he walked into my jailhouse and implied a threat." She wrapped her hands around the coffee cup. "I would need to consult with a proper attorney about the deed." about making the claim formal and legal so that Graves cannot simply wait me out or try to challenge it in court once I am exhausted. Ben Tolley knows a good man in San Antonio, Clyde said. Honest, careful, not afraid of powerful interests. She looked at him for a long time. He met her eyes with perfect steadiness. I will stay, she said, for now. Something moved in his expression and was quickly, carefully contained. All right, he said. She thought, watching him, that his restraint was one of the things she respected most about him, and also one of the things that made her want to dismantle it completely. The week that followed was both the most complicated and the most clarifying of her life. Calloway made 2 more attempts to approach her, both of which Clyde intercepted with a kind of quietly implacable authority that left Calloway with nothing actionable to do. On the 3rd attempt, Clyde informed Calloway that he had been identified as an agent of Edmund Graves of San Antonio, that a formal notice of Calloway's activities in Harlow had been filed with the county records, and that if anything untoward occurred to any resident of or visitor to Harlow, Calloway would be the first person Clyde came looking for. Calloway smiled pleasantly and said he understood perfectly and continued smiling in a way that made it clear he did not intend to give up. The county sheriff, Ben Tolley, arrived on Wednesday, a compact, silver-haired man with an efficient manner and a clear personal regard for Clyde that spoke to a history of mutual reliability. He reviewed the situation, spoke with Abigail for an hour with the focused attention of someone taking a legal deposition, and left for San Antonio the following morning with a letter from Abigail to the attorney, whose name was Harrington Coles. Harrington Coles replied by telegram 4 days later. He was familiar with the case. He was familiar with Edmund Graves. He had, as it happened, information regarding Graves's conduct in the transfer of the Pritchard land that might be relevant. He proposed a formal meeting. Progress, real progress, the kind that came from being in one place long enough for mail to find her. In the midst of all this, there was also Harlow itself. She had not planned to notice it, but she did. The town had its rhythms and its complications and its particular community of people. Mrs. Hannigan, who had figured out that Abigail's real name was not Marsh, but who seemed to regard this as merely interesting rather than concerning. Old Garrett Finch, the wagon man with the broken leg, who she visited twice because he was cantankerous and alone, and reminded her of her father at his worst, which was somehow still better than most people at their best. The Osai family, who ran the blacksmith shop, the father a man named Samuel who had come to Texas from Georgia after the war and built something solid in his own, and whose daughter Clara was 7, and had appointed herself Abigail's particular friend for reasons that were never explained but accepted. She helped Dr. Merritt, the town's physician, with his records for 3 days when his regular assistant was ill, because she could not be idle without it costing her something, and Dr. Merritt had the organized mind of someone who kept his instruments clean, and the chaotic filing habits of someone who had never met a cabinet he respected, and she found the work satisfying in a way that reminded her of what she had been reaching for before everything went wrong. Through all of it, Clyde was a constant presence that had nothing oppressive about it. He was simply there, in the way that reliable things are simply there, and she found herself orienting to that presence the way a compass orients north, not because she meant to, but because the pull was simply true. They talked. They talked about law and justice and the distance between them, which interested them both for reasons that were professional and personal, and sometimes indistinguishable. They talked about Texas and what it was becoming, the railroads pushing in and the old open ranges being fenced, and the sense of a world in the middle of becoming something else. They talked about the future in the abstract, careful way of people who are both being cautious about saying something too direct. One evening, 10 days after she had decided to stay, they were sitting outside the jailhouse in the cool of the evening, the sky above Harlow unspooling stars in quantities that she had forgotten were possible after years of city living, and she said, without entirely intending to, "I used to think I would argue cases." He was quiet for a moment. "Argue cases," he said, "in court. My father's cases to start with, then my own eventually. He was training me in his way. The law degree was the formal part of it. You would be excellent at it," he said. She turned to look at him. "That is a large claim based on limited evidence." "I have been watching you think through this land case for 2 weeks," he said. "The way you organize information, the way you follow an argument to its implications, you would be excellent at it." She felt the warmth under her sternum again, more insistent. "Women do not argue cases in Texas courts," she said. "Not yet," he said, in a tone that suggested he found the word yet to be of practical significance. She looked at the stars. She felt the shape of something possible, something she had stopped letting herself look at directly after her father died and the running started. It felt dangerous to look at it directly. It also felt like the most honest thing she had done in months. "Clyde," she said. "Yes," he said. "I'm not sure anymore whether I am staying because of the legal situation or because of something else." The silence was different now, charged in a particular way. "I'm not sure those two things need to be separate," he said very carefully. She turned toward him. He was already looking at her, had been looking at her, and the careful professional restraint she had been watching him maintain was present still but barely, the way a flame is present behind glass. "I have made a great many practical decisions in the past 18 months, she said. "I would like, just once, to make an impractical one." "Miss Pritchard," he said, and his voice was low and steady. "What are you saying?" She leaned forward and kissed him. He was still for exactly 1 second, and then he was not still at all, his hand coming up to the side of her face with such careful, concentrated tenderness that she felt it like a tuning fork struck and held. He kissed her back with the same directness he brought to everything, honest and unhurried and entirely present. And she thought, this is true. This is what true feels like, and she had not had that thought about anything in a very long time. When she drew back, the stars were still there, and the night was the same temperature, and the town was still 400 souls going about their ordinary lives, and everything was completely different. "Well," she said, somewhat breathlessly. "Well," he agreed, and the smile that came through was different from any she had seen from him before, unguarded and genuine and almost impossibly warm. She laughed. She pressed her hand over her mouth because she was laughing, and she was also crying slightly, which was undignified and true. "Are you all right?" he asked, concerned. "I am very all right," she said. "I am overwhelming myself, that is all." He took her hand, the one she had pressed over her mouth, and held it with deliberate care, and she let him, and they sat in the evening with their interlocked hands and the Texas stars, and did not need to say anything else for a while. It was 3 days after this that Calloway made his final move. She had been at the hotel parlor speaking with Mrs. Hannigan about the Founders' Day supper that Harlow held each November, which she had found herself being included in, with a naturalness that suggested Mrs. Hannigan had already privately decided she was staying. She was walking back to the jailhouse in the late afternoon when she heard the sound that she had learned, over months of necessary vigilance, to pay attention to. A sound that was wrong in context. She could not have named it precisely. A voice pitched too urgent, a door closing too fast. She moved quickly. She crossed the main street at an angle, came to the jailhouse from the side, looked through the window first as she had trained herself to do. Calloway, inside, with a gun, and Clyde on his knees. She stood in the doorway with the bag and the deed and Calloway's gun against Clyde's temple, and she looked at Clyde's eyes, finding hers with that single clear message, and she thought, not in words but in something more fundamental, "I will not lose this." She threw the bag. Clyde moved. The gun discharged into the ceiling, and then it was over. Calloway was arrested. He was held in the Harlow jail while Ben Tolley rode down from the county seat, and Calloway, faced with the formal charge of assault and the documented record of his activities in service of Edmund Graves, made the calculation that career loyalty had limits and began to talk. What he said was illuminating. Edmund Graves had not merely been attempting to reclaim the Pritchard land as a business matter. Thomas Pritchard had, in the weeks before his death, discovered irregularities in several land transfers that Graves had orchestrated over the preceding decade. Irregularities that, properly documented, would constitute fraud on a scale that would expose Graves to criminal prosecution. Thomas Pritchard had transferred the Bexar County deed to Abigail not merely to ensure she had an inheritance, but because the deed itself, when examined closely, contained notations in Thomas's hand that documented specific fraudulent transactions and identified the witnesses who could confirm them. Her father had hidden the evidence inside his gift to her. He had put it in her hands and trusted her to find it or to find someone who could. She sat with this for a long while after Calloway finished talking. "He knew," she said to Clyde. "He knew I would not understand what I had until I found someone to help me look." "And you found someone," Clyde said. She looked at him. The cut above his eyebrow had healed to a thin line. He was watching her with the same steady attention she had come to depend on, the kind that did not flinch from difficult things. "He trusted me to find the right person," she said quietly. "After everything, he trusted me." "You are eminently trustable," Clyde said. She pressed her lips together against something that threatened to be more crying. "I am going to need Harrington Coles here in person," she said. "Ben Tolley can arrange it," Clyde said. "Coles can be here inside a week." A week. She was not running anywhere. She had not thought once in the chaos of the afternoon about running. Harrington Coles arrived on the 8th of November 1878 on the morning stage from San Antonio. He was a small, precise man in his 50s, with the careful movements of someone who worked with important documents and knew it. He spent 2 full days with Abigail and Clyde and Ben Tolley, going through the deed, the notations, the testimony Calloway had provided, cross-referencing it against records he had brought with him from San Antonio. On the second evening, Coles took off his spectacles and rubbed them with a cloth and said, "Miss Pritchard, your father was a careful man." "Yes," she said. "The notations are sufficient. Combined with Calloway's testimony and 3 additional witnesses I have already spoken with, we have enough to bring formal charges against Edmund Graves. The land, I can tell you with reasonable confidence, will be secured to you within 3 to 6 months through normal legal proceedings." She sat back in her chair. 3 to 6 months, normal legal proceedings. She had been running for a year and a half, and here was the road simply, clearly ending. "Thank you," she said. Coles stayed 3 more days, completing the formal documentation, and when he left he took with him a complete package of evidence that was, he assured her, entirely too organized and indexed to be lost or overlooked. On the evening Coles departed, Abigail walked with Clyde to the edge of town where the scrubland began and the sky went wide and uninterrupted to the horizon. The weather had turned again, colder now, November announcing itself, and she had borrowed a wool coat from Mrs. Hannigan that was slightly too large and very warm. "It is almost over," she said. "The legal part," he agreed. She looked at him sideways. "Is there another part?" "There is the question," he said, "of what you do when it is finished, where you go." She stopped walking. He stopped beside her. "Clyde," she said, and her voice was steadier than she felt, which was saying something because she felt quite steady. "I have spent 18 months being careful about the future because I could not see past the immediate danger. The danger is ending. I can see the future now." She paused. "You are in it, clearly, unambiguously. I would like to know if you have an opinion about that." He turned to face her fully. The evening light was going amber and gold across the scrubland, and he looked at her with that complete attention that had been one of the first things she had noticed about him, and that had not once, in the weeks she had known him, felt like anything other than a gift. "I have a very strong opinion about that," he said. "Then say it," she said. "I want to marry you," he said. "I want you to stay in Harlow, and I want to marry you, and I want to watch you argue cases in whatever court will have you because it will happen. I am entirely certain of it." And I want to grow old in this town that nobody important has heard of with you, and I believe that is the best plan I have ever had." She was quiet for a long moment. "That is an extremely direct proposal," she said. "I told you early on that I believe you deserve to hear true things," he said. "You did," she said. "Yes," he blinked. "Yes to which part?" "To all of it," she said. "Yes to staying, yes to marrying you, yes to arguing cases, yes to this town." She stepped closer. "Yes to you, Clyde Dawson, yes." He took her face in his hands with that same careful, concentrated tenderness she remembered from the first kiss, and he kissed her in the amber light at the edge of Harlow, Texas. And the sky went on forever in every direction, and she did not feel the need to look for the exit. They were married on the 14th of December, 1878, in the Harlow church, which had acquired a new minister in November, a young man named Pastor Green, who was earnest and kind, and managed to deliver a ceremony that was both brief and genuine. Mrs. Hannigan organized the reception with the enthusiastic efficiency of someone who had been waiting for the opportunity since roughly the second week of Abigail's stay, and produced a supper of stunning abundance for a town that had not been given much advance notice. Samuel Osai and his family were there, Clara in a dress with a white collar and a very serious expression of ceremonial importance. Ben Tolley came down from the county seat. Old Garrett Finch arrived on crutches with his broken leg still healing, and sat in the front row with the proprietary air of a man who had decided he was family. Dr. Merritt attended and drank 2 glasses of punch, and made a speech about the value of medical record-keeping that somehow, in the warmth of the evening, seemed entirely appropriate. Abigail wore her best dress, which was a dark blue wool that she had purchased with some of the money Coles had arranged as an advance against the land settlement, and she stood at the front of the church with Clyde Dawson's hand in hers and looked at him and thought, "This is the most deliberate thing I have ever done," and she meant it as the highest possible praise. He wore his good suit, which was somewhat worn at the elbows but well kept, and he looked at her with that complete, steady attention that she now understood was simply love, the particular form his love took, total and unperforming and present. Pastor Green asked the questions. They gave the answers. It was done. The winter settled in around Harlow with the mild, dry cold of South Texas, and Abigail settled in with it. The spare room at the jailhouse was no longer her room. The small house on the south end of Main Street, which Clyde rented from the town at a modest monthly rate, became hers with the comfortable authority of someone who has at last stopped being temporary. She made it into a home with the same methodical care she brought to everything, and was surprised by how much she enjoyed it, how much she had missed the simple pleasure of a space that stayed the same from one day to the next, of objects that had histories and stayed where she left them. Edmund Graves was formally charged in January of 1879. The case moved through the San Antonio courts with the systematic momentum of something that had been properly built, and in April of 1879, Graves was convicted on 3 counts of land fraud. He was sentenced to 7 years in the state penitentiary and ordered to make restitution to 7 individuals whose land had been obtained through false means. The Bexar County deed, the 600 acres of river land in Abigail's name, was confirmed as legally secure. Harrington Coles sent her a telegram. She read it at the kitchen table on a Tuesday morning in April with the spring sun coming through the window, and she sat with it for a moment, running her thumb across the words, thinking about her father. He had trusted her. He had hidden the evidence in the thing that was hers and trusted her to find the way to use it. She thought about the year and a half of running, of fear, of lonely rooms in anonymous towns. She thought about what it had cost her and what it had given her, the unlikely, unrepeatable path that had led her to a jailhouse in Harlow, Texas, and a desk that needed organizing and a man who told true things. "Graves is convicted," she told Clyde when he came in for lunch. "The land is confirmed." He set down his hat and read the telegram and looked at her. "How do you feel?" he asked. She thought about it honestly. "Relieved," she said, and sad and grateful all at the same time. He sat down across from her and took her hand and said nothing, which was exactly the right thing. In June of 1879, Abigail discovered she was pregnant. She sat with this knowledge for 2 days before telling Clyde, not out of hesitation, but because she wanted to carry it quietly herself for a small time to get used to the shape of it. When she told him on a Sunday morning with the window open and the smell of June coming through and the sound of Harlow beginning its day, he was very still for a moment, and then a smile moved across his face like dawn arriving, slow and then suddenly everywhere. "A baby," he said. "That is generally how it works," she said. He laughed, which was the best sound she had heard in some time, and took her in his arms with the careful gentleness he brought to things that mattered greatly to him, and she stood in the circle of it with her face against his shoulder, and felt the future arranging itself around them like something true. The boy was born in February of 1880, a cold, clear morning with frost on the window glass, delivered by Dr. Merritt with his usual calm efficiency and considerable goodwill. He was a healthy, vigorous boy with dark hair and serious eyes, and he arrived in the world with what Abigail described as an expression of considered skepticism that she attributed to the Pritchard side. They named him Thomas for her father. Clyde held him with the focused care of someone who was both entirely sure this mattered and entirely unsure whether he was holding him correctly, and she watched him figure it out with patient trial and adjustment, and loved him more than she had believed was still available to her to feel. Clara Ose appointed herself Thomas's unofficial guardian, and came to visit twice a week with a seriousness of purpose that was entirely charming, and Mrs. Hannigan provided enough food in the first 2 weeks after the birth to sustain a considerably larger household, and Garrett Finch, whose leg had healed well enough to abandon the crutches, arrived with a wooden cradle he had made himself that was beautifully fitted and slightly uneven on the left side, which somehow made it perfect. Life in Harlow continued its rhythms around them, and they moved through it together. Clyde was re-elected sheriff in the fall of 1880, running unopposed, which he characterized as a lack of ambition on the part of the citizenry, and which the citizenry characterized as satisfaction with the current arrangement. He was good at his job in ways that were quiet and consistent, the kind of goodness that does not make headlines but that a town knows in its bones. Abigail, in the spring of 1880, had written to the state bar with an inquiry about the examination requirements. She had sent a carefully constructed letter, formal and precise, and had received back an equally formal and considerably less precise reply that was not an outright refusal, but was not an invitation either. She had not been surprised. She had also not been deterred. She had returned to her reading, the legal texts she had kept through everything, the ones she had carried in the bottom of her bag through all the running and the hiding and the moving, because she had not been willing to leave them behind even when leaving everything else. She read and she studied, and she wrote analyses that Harrington Coles agreed to review through correspondence, and he wrote back comments that were stringent and useful, and she found that the 1.5 years of practical legal navigation had given her an understanding of how the law actually worked in lived situations that supplemented the textbook education in ways she had not expected. In the meantime, she worked. She was not someone who could be idle. She helped Coles on 3 more cases through correspondence, doing research and document work that he compensated her for fairly and openly. She organized the county records that Ben Tolley had been meaning to properly file for years. She helped 2 women in Harlow with property questions that their husbands had not resolved and that affected them materially, working through the legal framework with them carefully, and finding the solutions that the framework allowed. The law was not always just. She knew that. The structure of it was built by men and for men, and the gaps in it were real and significant. She knew that too. She worked within it anyway, and pushed at the edges of it where she could, and told herself and meant it that change came from people who stayed inside the system long enough to move the walls. In 1881, Harrington Coles wrote to tell her that a colleague of his in San Antonio was forming a law office and was looking for a partner with particular skills in property and land law, and an interest in representing clients of limited means, women and freedmen and homesteaders who were being squeezed out of their land by the same machinery that had targeted her father. The colleague's name was Josephine Hart, and she had passed the state bar in 1879 through the same gaps in the examination rules that allowed women to sit for it in Texas, and she was, Coles said, formidable. Abigail read the letter 3 times. She brought it to Clyde that evening, and he read it once and said, "San Antonio is not so far." "No," she said, "it is not. And correspondence work is not the same as being in a courtroom," he said. "No," she said, "it is not." He looked at her steadily. "When does she need an answer?" "By the end of the month," Abigail said. "Do you want to take it?" he said. She looked at him. "Yes," she said. "I want to sit the examination. I want to qualify properly. I want to take cases and argue them. I want to do the work." "Then do it," he said simply. "We have Thomas," she said, "and the house, and your work here. San Antonio is a day's ride," he said. "You could take cases and come home, or take cases and bring me along when I can be spared, or I could look into whether Harlow might survive without me for longer stretches than I currently permit myself to imagine." She looked at him for a long time. "You would consider leaving Harlow?" "I would consider whatever made sense for us," he said. "Harlow is home because you are in it. That is not a geographical fact, Abigail. That is a you fact." She pressed her fingers to her mouth. He waited, entirely patient. "We could write to Josephine Hart," she said. "We could," he agreed. She wrote to Josephine Hart. Josephine Hart wrote back with a letter that was 7 pages long, dense with specifics, and that was the most energizing thing Abigail had read since her father's legal commentaries. They entered into a correspondence that became, rapidly, a collaboration. Abigail sat the state bar examination in the fall of 1881, traveling to Austin for the purpose with Clyde and Thomas, who was by this point a walking, emphatic 20-month-old with opinions about everything. She passed. She stood on the street outside the examination office with the certification in her hand and felt her father very close, closer than she had in years. "Well," said Clyde, standing beside her with Thomas on his hip. "Well," she said. Thomas, unconcerned with legal certification, pointed at a horse tied across the street and said emphatically, "Horse." "Yes," said Clyde solemnly. "That is a horse." She laughed, the laughing and the crying at once again, and Clyde put his free arm around her shoulders and she leaned into him, and the Austin street went about its business around them. And she was Abigail Dawson now, licensed to argue in Texas courts, and the future was large and clear and entirely navigable. They arranged a working partnership with Josephine Hart that served the next 2 years well. Abigail took cases that could be managed through correspondence and periodic travel to San Antonio, while maintaining the life in Harlow that had become genuinely and deeply hers. Josephine, when she visited Harlow for a working week in the spring of 1882, was exactly as formidable as Coles had described. A woman of 40 with close-cropped hair and an absolute economy of expression who looked at Abigail's organization of her case notes and said, "Good," in a tone that Abigail understood immediately was the highest available praise. In the summer of 1882, Abigail won her first case argued in open court, a property dispute on behalf of a widow named Constance Mulberry, whose late husband's brother had been attempting to claim her homestead through procedural technicalities. She stood before the judge in San Antonio in the August heat and argued with the organized intensity of someone who had been preparing for precisely this for her entire adult life. And when the judgment came back in Constance Mulberry's favor, she sat down at the counsel table and placed her hands flat on the surface and breathed. She wrote to Harrington Coles. She wrote to Josephine. She wrote to her father's grave in San Antonio, which she had not done before and which she did now, simply and honestly, telling him what she had done and thanking him for the deed and the notations and the trust, for all of it. Life in Harlow deepened. Thomas grew with the remarkable velocity of small children, acquiring language and opinions and a particular devotion to the horse bishop, who was aging gracefully and permitted Thomas's presence with stoic tolerance. Clara Ose remained Thomas's most devoted friend, and her younger brother William, born in 1881, rounded out the small household's orbit of affection. In the spring of 1883, Abigail discovered she was pregnant again. She told Clyde at breakfast, quietly and directly, and he put down his coffee cup and looked at her with the same dawning smile as the first time, undiminished. "Thomas will be a brother," she said. "Or a sister," Clyde pointed out. "Or a sister," she agreed. It was a sister, born in October of 1883, small and precise and immediately certain of her preferences. They named her Alina for no reason except that it suited her, and Thomas received her with 3-year-old solemnity, and thereafter regarded her as a project requiring his ongoing supervision, which Alina, as she developed opinions of her own, received with diminishing enthusiasm. The land in Bexar County, the 600 acres of river land that had cost so much and traveled so far, was in 1884 leased to a family named Vasquez who were working the river bottom and doing well with it. Abigail had met Mateo and Rosa Vasquez through Ben Tolley, who knew the family from his county rounds. They were people who understood the land and worked it with the kind of care that her father would have appreciated, and the arrangement suited everyone. She went to see it once, the land, traveling out from San Antonio with Clyde on a clear October day. They left the children with Mrs. Hannigan, who had by this point elevated informal grandmothering to an art form, and rode out into the river country in the early morning. It was beautiful. Wide and green along the river bottom, the live oaks enormous and old, the land rolling with a gentle authority that she had not expected. The Vasquez family showed them around with quiet pride, and Abigail walked the boundary and thought about her father walking it, noting things in the margins of the deed, building the legal architecture that would eventually protect what was his and hand it forward. She stood at the river and Clyde stood beside her, and the water moved the way rivers do, continuous and indifferent and permanent. "This is what he was keeping," she said. "Yes," Clyde said. "I understand it now," she said. "I could not see it before. I only saw the trouble of it. Now I see what he saw." Clyde took her hand. They stood at the river for a while, not needing to say more. On the ride back in the long amber light of the October afternoon, she said, "I want to practice full-time in San Antonio. Josephine is asking and it is time and I want to." He was quiet for a moment. "San Antonio," he said. "San Antonio," she said. "Harlow is home and always will be. We come back for everything that matters, but the work is there and I need to be where the work is." He rode in silence for a moment. "Ben Tolley mentioned last spring that he was thinking of retiring," he said, "and that the county sheriff position would need a new occupant." She turned to look at him. "You would consider the county job?" "It would mean the same work on a larger geography," he said. "It would mean San Antonio as often as needed, which would mean being where you are when you are there." He paused. "It would mean a different kind of life than the one we have made in Harlow." "Is that something you want?" she asked. He looked at her with that complete, steady regard. "I want the life that fits us both," he said. "I always have." She thought about a jailhouse spare room and a desk that needed organizing and a man who told true things and meant them. "Then we plan it," she said. They planned it over the winter of 1884 and 1885, careful and thorough, the way two people who have both learned the cost of being unprepared make plans. Clyde spoke with Ben Tolley, who confirmed his retirement for the spring of 1885 and endorsed Clyde for the county position with the uncomplicated directness of someone who had made his opinion clear in advance. The county commissioners voted in the spring of 1885. Clyde Dawson became the sheriff of Bexar County. They moved to San Antonio that June. to a house on the west side of the city that had high windows and a yard that Thomas immediately began colonizing, and that Alina circled with assessing eyes before announcing that her bedroom would be the room with the most light. Abigail walked into the offices of Hart and Dawson on a Monday morning in June of 1885 and sat at the desk that had her name on the door and arranged her books and felt the particular satisfaction of a life that had been rebuilt from nothing into something chosen. Josephine came in shortly after, looked at Abigail at her desk and said, "Good. We have 5 new cases. The Henderson widow, a homestead matter, is the most urgent." "Tell me about it," Abigail said, and Josephine sat down and began to tell her, and they were immediately in the work together, the way they always were, and the morning moved forward. Harlow remained. They went back 4 times a year, for Founder's Day and for Christmas, and for the occasions that accumulated around a town where they had roots. Mrs. Hannigan had by 1886 become genuinely too old to run the hotel herself, but had handed management to her niece with conditions, and continued to occupy the parlor and organize everyone's social lives from a seated position. Garrett Finch had died in 1884, peacefully, in his own bed, and Abigail had stood at his grave and felt the missing of him in a way that spoke to what he had given her, which was the experience of being claimed by a cantankerous, loving stranger without either party making a particular agreement about it. Samuel and Adiz Osai had expanded the blacksmith shop into a full ironworks, Samuel's skill and reputation growing with the years. Clara was, by 1886, 16 and reading every book she could obtain, and Abigail had arranged a correspondence with Harrington Coles on her behalf that was expanding Clara's legal education in a direction she was pursuing with fierce determination. On a visit to Harlow in the fall of 1886, Thomas, who was 6, came running into the kitchen of the old house, which the town had kept available for their visits, with a turtle he had found in the yard and a detailed plan for its care and housing. Abigail looked at her son's serious face and her husband's expression as he examined the turtle with appropriate gravity, and Alina's expression, which combined scientific interest with aesthetic reservations, and she thought, with sudden, flooding certainty, that her father would have loved this, would have loved all of it, the mess and the noise and the fullness of it. She thought of the deed in the lining of her bag, a lifetime ago, and the jailhouse, and the Texas stars, and how everything that had seemed like catastrophe had led in its convoluted, exhausting, improbable way to here. In 1887, Hart and Dawson won a case in the Texas Supreme Court on behalf of a collective of small landowners against a railroad company that had been using procedural fraud to acquire land rights without proper compensation. It was the largest case Abigail had argued, and the most consequential, and she argued it across 3 days with Josephine beside her and Clyde in the gallery watching with that unwavering attention. And when the judgment came down in their favor, she stood at the council table and thought of all the people who would keep their land because of this, and felt a justice that was not simple or complete but was real, and that was enough. She went back to the house that evening and found Clyde cooking, which he had learned to do with the same patient competence he applied to everything, and Thomas doing his school work at the kitchen table with the concentrated frown he inherited from his mother, and Alina playing with her collection of small rocks in the corner with the concentrated frown she inherited from both of them. "We won," she said. "I know," said Clyde. "I was there." "I know you were," she said. He looked at her over his shoulder from the stove with that smile, the real one, the dawn one, and she felt it land the same way it always had, unchanged by years and familiarity, because love was like that, she had learned. It did not wear thin with use, it deepened, it became more itself. It became the ground under everything. "Sit down," he said. "Supper is almost ready." She sat down. Thomas looked up from his work and said, with the complete confidence of a 7-year-old whose parents had won things before, "Did you win the big case, Mama?" "We did," she said. He nodded as though this confirmed something he had already concluded and went back to his arithmetic. Eleanor put down her rocks and came and climbed into Abigail's lap with the decisive efficiency she brought to physical affection, and Abigail put her arms around her and tucked her chin over Eleanor's dark head, and looked at the kitchen and the supper, and the man at the stove and the boy at the table, and the life she had built out of a deed, and a secret, and a bag thrown at the right moment. She thought about running, how it had felt like the only available motion for so long. How stopping had been the most terrifying and most correct thing she had ever done. In a jailhouse in a town nobody important had heard of, with a man who told true things. She thought about her father who had trusted her with the hardest thing he had. She thought about what she had done with that trust, where she had carried it, what she had built with it. Good, she thought. Good. In the years that followed, the life grew and deepened in the way of lives that are genuinely inhabited. Clyde served as sheriff of Bexar County, with the same quiet, consistent excellence he had brought to Harlow, gaining a reputation for fairness that crossed lines most men in his position did not trouble themselves to acknowledge. He worked alongside people that the system too often worked against, and he was not naive about the limits of his position, but he used what he had as fully as he could. Abigail argued 17 more cases in her years with Josephine Hart, winning 14, losing 2 outright and 1 on appeal, which she subsequently won on further appeal. She argued cases for women whose inheritances had been stripped, for freedmen whose land had been taken through technicality and intimidation, for homesteaders facing the railroad machinery. She lost cases that she was certain she should have won and won cases that had seemed impossible, and she learned the texture of justice as it actually existed rather than as it was supposed to. And she went on working anyway because stopping was not available to her. Clara Osai, in 1892, became the second woman to pass the Texas State Bar after a particular amendment to the examination rules. And Abigail was in Austin for the announcement and embraced Clara in the street outside the examination office, and they both cried without particular concern for dignity. Thomas grew into a young man with his father's directness and his mother's tenacity, and went to study law at the University of Texas when it opened its doors in Austin in 1883, and was in his first year when a letter arrived from him containing the intelligence that he had met someone remarkable. Her name was Petra. She was the daughter of a German immigrant family outside of Austin, and she argued with Thomas about everything and was usually right. "I like her already," Abigail said, and read the letter to Clyde in the kitchen of the San Antonio house, and watched him smile at his coffee cup. Eleanor grew into a young woman of formidable precision, who had her mother's love of organized information and her father's patience, and an additional quality that was entirely her own, a kind of focused clarity that made people feel entirely known when she looked at them. She had by the early 1890s developed a serious interest in medicine, and Dr. Merritt, when they visited Harlow, spent an entire afternoon talking to her about it with the concentrated attention he gave to things he found genuinely interesting. In 1893, Josephine Hart retired, and the office on the west side of San Antonio became Abigail's entirely, with a younger attorney named Marcus Webb joining as partner, a man of 30 who had clerked for Harrington Coles and who had the promising combination of intelligence and willingness to listen. In the spring of 1893, 15 years after she had arrived on the stage from San Antonio with $2.40 and a secret in her bag, Abigail Dawson stood at the window of her law office in San Antonio and looked out at the street and thought about the full shape of the time between then and now. She thought about the jailhouse spare room, about the conversation over coffee on the 5th morning when she had decided to stay, about the stars on the evening Clyde had told her his true thing and she had kissed him in the dark. She thought about Thomas Pritchard, her father, and the deed with the notations in the margin, the long patience of a man who had made mistakes and known it and tried, in the end, to leave something that would hold. She thought about the 600 acres of river land, running sweet along the Bixar County water, the Vasquez family working it and caring for it, and the live oaks enormous and old above the river, the water moving the way rivers do, continuous and indifferent and permanent. She heard the door open. She did not need to turn to know. Clyde's footsteps crossed the office floor, and she felt his hands settle on her shoulders, warm and steady the way they always were. "Ready?" he said. "For what?" she said. "Thomas and Petra arrived this evening," he said, "and Alina said she would come for supper." She turned within his hands and faced him. 15 years, and his face was more weathered, his hair more silver at the temples, and his eyes were the same, dark and steady, and carrying the same quality she had recognized in the jailhouse on a difficult afternoon in October of 1878, a quality she had finally and accurately named long ago: love. The kind that did not perform itself, the kind that was simply present continuously, like water, like weather, like the ground under your feet. "Ready," she said. He offered her his arm. She took it. They left the office together and stepped out into the San Antonio afternoon, and the city went about its life around them, and they walked through it toward the house and the children and the supper and the evening, and the story of Abigail and Clyde Dawson continued in all the ordinary, extraordinary ways that stories do when they are real and they are not finished, and they are, in the deepest sense, good. She squeezed his arm as they walked. He covered her hand with his. The afternoon light fell warm and wide across the city, and the future moved ahead of them, navigable and clear, belonging entirely to them, earned and chosen and irreplaceable and theirs.